Hello and welcome to CodeSlicing. In this episode, we're going to be building on what we learned in part 1 and applying it to the linear use case. If you missed it, don't worry, there's plenty of time to go back and watch it. I'll be waiting right here for you when you get back. With that said, let's get on with it. First off, let's create a horizontal indicator that we can work with. As we did before, to ensure a size agnostic indicator, we're going to need a geometry reader. And before that, we're going to stick in the number of segments. And we're going to have 15 segments for this one. And these segments are going to be laid out in an H stack. And if you want to space something out in a linear stack, be it horizontal or vertical, you have two main options. You can either explicitly control the spacing, as we did in the now playing overlay episode, or you can set the spacing of the H stack to 0 and control the layout with spaces. I'm going to use the latter method this time, since it's a bit easier to work with when you don't care about the size of the spaces explicitly. So we have an H stack and we set the spacing to 0. And then we lay out our segments here in a for each, 0 to the number of segments, index in, and as we did in the circular example, we're just going to use capsules as the segments. All we need to do with these capsules is set the width, because the height is going to be controlled by the height of the frame. So we set the width to the width scaled by 0.02. We want to put a spacer after every segment as long as it's not the last segment. So we need a little bit of a condition here. If the index is less than the number of segments minus 1, we want to put a spacer in. Now there is a small problem here that might not be completely obvious from what you're seeing on the screen. And that is that there is a minimum width for a spacer by default. If I increase the number of segments to say 25, you can see that it breaks the boundary of the frame due to that minimum width I was talking about. So what we need to do is set the minimum width of the spacer to 0. And there it fills the space exactly the way we want. So I can go back up here, set that back to 15, and we're all good. Now let's get busy with the all-important mask and call it Horizontal Activity Indicator Mask. We know it's going to be animating, so we might as well set up the state to support that while we're here. Animating, and we'll set that to false. But I'm also going to be adding a debug property for reasons which will become clear in a few minutes. And I'll default that to false. The implementation itself will comprise a raw linear gradient. But before we do that, let's set up that extension on color that we implemented in part 1 for clear red. There we go. In addition, what we learned in that episode is that we know using gradient stops is going to give us the control we're going to need as we fine-tune the fading of the mask a bit later on. So we're going to use those right from the get-go. Last thing is that this is all going to need another geometry reader because we're going to need to know how big this thing is in order to animate it the way we want. Linear gradient. And here are the stops we need. I'm going to separate them out onto different lines. Clear red. 0, red at 1. Let's give ourselves a bit more space. This gradient is going to go to the trailing edge. And before we go any further, so we can see what we're doing, let's set up this mask as a background. Horizontal Activity Indicator Mask. And now we can resume. And there we can see the mask in all its glory. We're going to achieve the animation we want using two separate offset modifiers because we need to offset the start position and animate the offset from that starting position. You could do this in one modifier, but that would be less clear since you'd be doing the full offset calculation in place. The first thing we need to do is set the offset of this linear gradient to the start position, which is going to be minus the full width of the frame. X offset minus geo width. There it is, all the way over to the left, ready to animate across the frame. And that's going on the next line. We want to offset this in the X axis, but only if we're animating. And we offset it by the width scaled by 2. So it's going to go all the way across and off the other side. Then in onAppear, inside an animation block, using an animation that is linear with a duration of 1, we're going to repeat forever with auto reverses set to false. And then we set animating to true. Then we go up here, and instead of background, we say mask We comment out the background. We play. And there we are. Very good. But where does that debug property that I was banging on about and went to the trouble to include come into the picture? Let's stop that and find out. The answer lies in the fine control that we want to have over the fading and shape of the mask. As it stands, when I switch this back to background, the mask isn't sitting on top of the segments, so you have to use your imagination for how it's going to affect the segments when it's running. So let's fix that by using a conditional modifier on the start offset. We're going to say xoffset if not debug. We're also going to use this debug property in the animation offset and not debug. And now if I go to the point at which we're initializing our mask, I can pass in debug is true here, and we can see the mask and how it will precisely affect the segments in place just like that. Brilliant. And now if I comment in the mask and comment out the background, we can see even more clearly how it affects our segments. So if I wanted to fade that out more quickly, I can simply go down to our mask and alter this gradient stop. So I can say 0.5, and it will only go halfway across. If I try 0.4, that looks pretty good. I can change that back to false, play, and we've got a lovely looking horizontal indicator. Remember how we blurred the circular mask because you could see the lead edge of the mask transitioning the segments a bit? Well, we're going to use a different approach here because we're using gradient stops, so we have really fine control. Instead of blurring it this time, what I'm going to do is add another clear segment below the red one. And then what I can do is say that the red finishes at 0.95 and then the clear comes in at 1, which will cover over those cracks nicely. But what if we wanted to make it bounce from side to side like the anamorphic equalizer on the front of the Knight Industries 2000? All we need to do is say that the clear starts at 0.1, say, it finishes at 0.9, and the red is happening at 0.5. So we've got a centered mask there, fading out equally on the left and right. And then all we need to do is change auto reverses to true. Then I can set debug back to false and play. Isn't it wonderful? Obviously, a lot of this can be parameterized, but I'm sure you get the general idea. But as flexible as these continuous masks are, there are in fact instances where you really do want to have discrete control over the opacity of these segments. So in the next episode, we're going to be looking at how we can achieve that. It's quite a bit more complex. We're going to be going deep into the animatable protocol and learning a lot along the way. So join me for that. It's going to be brilliant. If you're not subscribed and that kind of thing piques your interest, consider doing that and you're a lot less likely to miss it. Don't forget to like the video if you found it useful, and if you have any questions, comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.